up, my dad loved to force me to watch some of his favorite movies. Over and over again in my childhood, I think he saw it as this like father-son bonding thing, where he would just like make me watch his favorite movies he thought were the classics, and that way he could, do his due diligence as a dad. And so to this day, I like a lot more 80s movies and like early 90s movies than most people my age. My dad made me watch all of them. In fact, one of my favorite movies, one that he forced me to watch a lot, so I just ended up liking it because I had to, was a movie you probably know pretty well called City Slickers. Yes, if you've never seen it, it's the story of this guy named Mitch Robbins, played by Billy Crystal. He's a Manhattan native. He's approaching 40 years old and is kind of going through a midlife crisis of sorts. And in the midst of this, he gets roped into going on this cattle drive in the Southwest with a couple of his buddies, Phil and Ed, who, by the way, are going through their own issues in life, some difficulties they're dealing with. And so the three of these guys together are kind of like escaping reality, some of their problems, and are trying to prove their manhood, even though they have no clue what they're doing on this cattle drive. Makes for some pretty hilarious moments along the way. But it's interestingly enough, probably my favorite part of that whole movie is a serious moment that takes place in the middle of it. In fact, I think it's one of my favorite scenes in any movie because it actually shows how guys actually talk to each other. Not very many movies are able to capture that very well. It does. It's middle of the cattle drive, beautiful day. They're all riding on horseback. And to kind of buy their time a little bit, they begin to have this discussion about their best day ever and their worst day ever. Mitch and Phil go first, and they talk about things like the first time they got to go to a Yankees game, the day they got married, dealing with a cancer scare or marital problems. But it's actually when things turn to Ed, the third guy in the trio, that things get truly compelling in the midst of the movie. His best day? He says this. He says, I'm 14 years old. My mother and father are fighting again, because she caught him again. This time the girl actually stopped by the house to pick him up. And I realized in that moment that he wasn't just cheating on my mother, he was cheating on us. And so I told him, I said, you're bad to us. We don't love you. I can take care of my mother and my sister. We don't need you here. And he made like he was going to strike me, but I didn't flinch. He turned around and he left and he never bothered us again. And from that day on, I took care of my mother and my sister. That was my best day. Kind of like stunned by his transparency and this moment, the other two guys look at each other and then they ask him, then what in the world was your worst day? His answer, same day. Same day. This morning, we are in week 2 of a series we kicked off last week called Blueprint. A series where we are going to be studying the life of this Old Testament character named Joseph. His life is this great model. It's a blueprint for us of what faithfulness looks like as a follower of God. He's faithful in so many different ways. Faithful in the midst of family turmoil, as we saw last week. Faithful in temptation. He's faithful in the midst of discouragement. He's faithful when presented with the chance to be materialistic. He's faithful when he could have revenge. And this morning we're going to see that he's faithful in the midst of adversity. We're going to see Joseph's worst day. No doubt about it. This is going to be his worst day that we're going to see. But because of his faithfulness, it's also his best day. Now that might seem a little contradictory, that might seem confusing, but I want you to get a chance to see what I mean. So if you've got a Bible or an electronic device on you, open up with me to Genesis chapter 37. If you don't have one of those, grab one of the church Bibles around you, and please take that home as a gift from us. We want you to be able to have God's word in your hands, accessible all the time. Please take this as a gift from us. It's going to be on page 24 and 25 in those Bibles. And pick up with me in verse 12. It's also going to appear on the screen. It says, soon after this, Joseph's brothers went to pasture their father's flocks at Shechem. When they had been gone for some time, Jacob said to Joseph, your brothers are pasturing sheep at Shechem. Get ready, and I will send you to them. I'm ready to go, Joseph replied. Go and see how your brothers and flocks are getting along, Jacob said. Then come back and bring me a report. So Jacob sent him on his way, and Joseph traveled to Shechem from their home in the valley of Hebron. Go ahead and pause there. This passage kind of sets the stage for what we're going to read about Joseph's worst day. As Daryl described last week, Joseph was born into the midst of a very dysfunctional family in every sense of the word. He was one of 13 kids born of 4 different mothers. I mean, this is like the show Sister Wives on steroids, okay? You can imagine the family drama and the backbiting and all the issues, the politicking going on behind the scenes. And Joseph is right in the midst of all of that, right at the heart of it. You see, because he's daddy's favorite. He's talented, he's gifted, he's actually been given the ability by God to interpret dreams. And it becomes pretty crystal clear to everybody else in the family that Jacob, their dad, loves Joseph just a little bit more than he does the rest of them. In fact, it didn't take being a rocket science to figure this out. You know, Jacob actually presents Joseph with this special robe that he doesn't give to anyone else in the family, basically saying, "You're my favorite child, you're special indeed." A robe that Joseph was, pretty proud, kind of being a young, arrogant guy. He was pretty glad to show that off to the rest of the family about how great he was, about all his talent, all his giftedness. That brings us to the passage that we just read. Joseph is now 17 years old, and his father has asked him to go. It's a little bit of a distance away where his brothers are tending to their flocks, to go give a report to him. Now, maybe the question comes up in your mind, like, why is Joseph not doing manual labor himself? I mean, he's 17 years old. He's like the perfect age to be doing manual labor, to be out attending to the flocks of sheep. Well, again, he's daddy's favorite. He's getting preferential treatment that nobody else in the family is getting. And so some of you grew up with siblings, and you know sibling rivalries really well, so you know how this is about ready to go down. Joseph's the second youngest in the family. He's getting ready to go out to all of his older brothers and get a report for dad so he can go tell on them. This isn't going to be good. And these guys couldn't already stand him. In fact, verse 4 of chapter 37 says that they couldn't say a kind word about him. They hated Joseph. And so you bring this situation into the fold, and some fireworks are about ready to happen. In fact, look with me at verse 18, what begins to unfold. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. As he approached, they made plans to kill him. "Here comes the dreamer," they said, kind of like mocking him sarcastically. "Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." So thanks to Joseph's robe, he's kind of a marked man, okay? There's no espionage taking place here, okay? They see him in a distance with that special robe on, and it gives them plenty of time to begin to scheme and to plan what they want to do. And they ultimately decide that they hate him so much that they want to kill him. And nobody's here to rescue Joseph. He's far away from home. Daddy can't protect him anymore. This is kind of like mom and dad leaving home to run some errands and leaving the kids there, and the older sibling telling the younger one, like, "Let's see if mom and dad can hear you cry now," okay? That's about what's getting ready to take place here. He is in deep trouble. Thankfully, one of his brothers, Reuben, who doesn't like him either, but convinces the brothers as he still approaches that they shouldn't kill him directly, that they should just leave him in the well to die. That way they don't have to shed his blood. They don't have his blood directly on their hands. It's a plan really for Reuben to come back and save Joseph. Culturally speaking, there were some reasons why he would want to save Joseph. Beyond the fact, I think he probably wanted to play hero and show his dad, like, "Hey, look at me, I'm pretty great too." But his plan doesn't work. He's not going to be able to save Joseph, but he does at least save his life. In fact, the brothers take him up on his advice, and we see down in verse 23, it said, "When Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the beautiful robe he was wearing. And then they grabbed him, and they threw him in the cistern. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it." This has quickly become Joseph's worst day. He's young. He's talented. He's been given this nice position by dad in the family. His whole future is ahead of him. He's flying high. In the midst of this, when he least expected, he hits rock bottom. Literally. He gets pushed and thrown into this cistern. It would have likely been, we know, probably 20 to 25 feet deep, carved out of pure limestone so that it could have been stored water. This one's empty. So the landing, you can imagine, probably didn't feel very good. He's beat up, he's bruised, he's banged up, knowing from the moment he hits the bottom of that pit that everything is about ready to change. A moment of adversity. In fact, he had to have been freaked out, sitting in the darkness of that pit, listening to his brothers just a few feet above him, scheming that they were actually going to sell him into slavery. He was powerless, knowing that everything that he loved was about ready to be stripped away from him. His family, his future, everything that he knew. And I want to pause because I think some of us can probably relate to what Joseph was going through in that moment. You've had a moment like this. Maybe you can recall a time in your childhood when things were going great. You thought you had this great childhood, that you get called into the living room by mom and dad and you see some luggage by the front door. They tell you that they're getting a divorce and that dad's moving out. Or life's going really good and you get this call from the doctor saying you need to come in and talk about some recent test results. Or you're flying high and your boss calls you into the office and blindsides you with the information that you've been let go from the company. Or you've been clean for years thinking you've conquered your addiction. It's no longer a problem to you when suddenly you trip up and find yourself doing something that you thought you were beyond. Or maybe you feel like you got this great marriage and you find a text message from a spouse indicating that they're having an affair. Or your teenage son or daughter, the one that you're the most proud of, is involved in something that you never thought they would be. And in these moments, everything changes. You see, just like Joseph, each and every one of us go through moments where we get pushed into the pit out of the blue. In moments when we least expect it, when we're the most vulnerable, just like Joseph. And you see, Joseph shows us that we can't really avoid these moments. They're just a part of life. A lot of us like to try to insulate ourselves away from them, like, hey, if I make enough money, or if I save enough money, or if I avoid those things, or if I avoid doing this, then I can avoid trouble in my life. I think Jesus had something to say about that. You're not going to be able to. In fact, we need to realize that no matter how hard we try, at some point we will feel the darkness of the pit, realizing we are powerless to control the circumstances around us. You can't insulate yourself away from trouble. You're going to find the pit. Many of us in the room probably know that all too well. But we do have a choice we can make. Are these moments going to make us or break us? You know, the reality is that they're going to define our lives. We have no choice in that. They always end up defining our lives, but we do have the choice of whether these moments are going to harm us or whether these moments are going to help us. You see, Joseph had that same decision to make thousands of years ago, whether or not this moment was going to define him in a negative sense. Think about it from his perspective. He's been physically beat up by his brothers. He's actually been stripped of his robe, his clothes, his dignity, sold into slavery, taken away in chains like an animal. In his mind, as he left that pit that day, he probably thought that he was never going to see his family again, working as a slave in some field somewhere for the remainder of his days. And even though he'd gotten out of the pit physically, he could have mentally and spiritually stayed there for the rest of his life, letting it define him. Just throwing in the towel and giving up. Or living with a depressed spirit, like a woe is me. Look what I've gone through. My whole life is over. Or living with anger and this need for revenge, like out of some great movie that we like to watch. But amazingly, it doesn't. In fact, we read this incredible phrase in Genesis chapter 39 as he begins his trek, his journey as a slave. 5 incredible words. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. What a profound phrase. I think it's important that we pause and at least understand something about God's faithfulness here. I mean, we're hearing this phrase, and we're going to hear it again several times in this series. It appears over and over again. God had never abandoned Joseph. Even in his lowest moments, even in his most lonely times, God was there. God cared. God was working. But this morning, and the point that I ultimately want to make, is that Joseph still had to make a decision of whether or not he was going to allow God to work in his life. I mean, he could have decided to allow his past, some of the things that had happened to him, to define him for the rest of his life. He could have stayed in that pit spiritually and emotionally, never moving beyond it. But instead, Joseph decided to allow God and what he could do to define him rather than what had happened to him. In fact, there's another incredible phrase that's going to appear, and we're going to probably hear this verse several times again. Joseph says some pretty profound things to his brothers later on in his life. The same brothers who hurt him, sold him into slavery, and actually stole some of the best years of his life, a couple of decades actually. He's going to get to the place where he can actually look them in the face and say, you intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. Some translations say, what you intended for evil, because it was evil. No doubt about it. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. You want to talk about an incredible life motto. Joseph, from the moment he left that pit and for the remainder of his life, made the decision that he was not going to be defined by what had taken place. That wasn't going to own the rest of his life. Instead, he was going to move on, believing that God was greater than any of his trouble or adversity, and that there wasn't a single concern, a single issue, a single trouble that he faced that God couldn't use and ultimately redeem. Just like we sing in that song. God will make a way when there is none. And please understand me, I'm not saying that everything happens for a reason. Please hear me on this. I hate that phrase. I think our culture needs to quit saying it. It's not true. Just like Joseph, there's some things that just take place in our lives because of sin and because of evil. But what the Bible does teach us, and what we're going to see in Joseph's story, is that anything can be redeemed. There is nothing that is too sinful, that is too messy, that is too twisted, that God can't ultimately use it for his good. Joseph believed that, and because of it, his worst day is going to become his best day. When he was utterly powerless, he's going to become the most powerful. Because you're going to see that in the coming weeks, the rest of Joseph's story, he's going to go through some more troubles. But from this point on, it's not about his talent or his giftedness or anything like that anymore. It's about God. It's about God's power. He gets to a place where he understands this, and he starts living for something greater than himself. And I can't prove this totally. It doesn't come out and say it in Genesis. But I think Joseph found God truly on this day in the pit, in the midst of the darkness there. It was a moment where he released control, stopped living for himself, realized he couldn't control his own circumstances, and allowed himself to be plugged into a power source in God. He's no longer, for the rest of his story, a proud, arrogant man. Instead, he's a humble one, dependent on God's provision. And this is where I want to land the plane this morning and ask you the question, could the same thing be said of the problems and the issues that you've faced in your life? And maybe another way of saying this, has the adversity that you're facing harmed you or helped you? If we're being really honest, for a lot of us, our adversity has harmed us and is still harming us. In fact, it amazes me the amount of people through ministry that I run into and get to hear their stories who have allowed the issues and the problems and the adversity that they face to define their lives in a negative sense for the rest of their lives. For some, it's been an excuse for them to do hurtful things and to live out of bounds. That somehow they're excused to hurt themselves and to hurt other people just because they themselves have been hurt. Maybe you know somebody like that. Maybe it's you. That's how you're living your life. You've excused everything you've done, and somehow everybody just needs to take a step back and let you do whatever you want to do because you've gone through something tragic in your life or you've gone through a difficult time. And while we have compassion, really honestly, that idea is absurd. For others, they just allow the issues and the troubles they face to define the rest of their lives, allow it just to haunt them, to poison everything that they do. It ends up affecting every decision they make, every relationship that they're in. It ends up even affecting their faith. In fact, I meet with people quite frequently in my office, and it blows my mind the amount of people who have been holding on to hurts and adversity for years, sometimes decades. And it's heartbreaking to listen to them as they've allowed this to put them in a state of paralysis, unable to move on in their life. They've gotten out of the pit for a long time, but they're still mentally and emotionally there. And if that's you this morning, if you feel like you're in the midst of some dark clouds, or maybe you're in the darkness of the pit and you're just saying, man, I want to see some sunlight. Can I offer up something for you? There's another way. Your adversity doesn't just have to hurt you. It doesn't just have to harm you. It can also help you. That's what he did for Joseph. He allowed his worst day to become his best day. In fact, I want to start with this. I want you to know God's with you. Just as he was with Joseph. God has never abandoned you. He's never left your side. There's no low moment or lonely time that God hasn't been directly by your side. And God is still at work even in the midst of the mess. In fact, I love what Isaiah 43:2 says. God actually reminds us, he says, when you go through deep waters, you can notice, he says when, not if, when. When you go through deep waters, I will be with you. When you go through rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. When you walk through the fire of oppression, you will not be burned up. The flames will not consume you. God's with you. But like Joseph, many of us need to reorient our perspective. Because God can't work in our lives if we're not going to allow him to work in our lives. If we're going to continue to act like that some tragedy or some issue or some adversity we have faced has ruined the rest of our lives, has destroyed everything about us, we'll watch as we never move on in our lives. We'll continue to be haunted. Our lives will continue to be haunted and poisoned by the things that have taken place in our lives. But like Joseph, instead, if you'll choose to say, you know what, there is no issue, there is no problem, there is no concern that I can face in life, no adversity that I will ever have to tackle, that God can't use and ultimately redeem, that he's greater than those things, then you'll watch as God will completely transform you in the midst of that. If you'll lean into God in these moments, learn to lay at his feet some of the things that you're going on, you'll watch as he turns your mess into something meaningful. In fact, it amazes me, the New Testament writers, in particular James, in James chapter 1-2, loudly proclaim the greatness of our problems. He says, dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. Some of you is like, do I need to check my eyes? Did I just see that right? He said, my problem should be considered an opportunity for great joy? Is he for real? Yes, he is. The Bible explains to us that it's our moments in the pit that that God uses as a rebirth of sorts. That's why we would never hope for them, why we never pray for them, we never dream for them, that like Joseph, if we didn't go through them, we'd never truly become who God intended us to be and what he wanted us to become. It's these moments when we learn to let go of power and control of our lives, realizing we really don't control our own destiny, and we hand things over to God, and in our powerlessness, we become powerful. In fact, I can't think of any better example of this than in the life of Johnny Cash. In fact, it was his most defining moment that didn't even make the movie Walk the Line, kind of broke my heart, but it plays a huge part in his autobiography. In 1967, the man in black had hit rock bottom in his life, haunted by some of the things that he had done and some of the things that had been done to him. He was down, had dwindled himself to 150 pounds on a 6'2" frame, strung out on cocaine and pills and booze. He was a shadow of his former self. In fact, he had spent a lot of time in and out of hospitals and jails, had wrecked multiple cars, had canceled countless concerts because he was too wasted to stand on stage and actually sing. In fact, by October of that year, he was on the edge of death. In fact, in his autobiography, he says he was the picture of it. Hadn't slept in days, hadn't eaten anything except handfuls of amphetamines. He was whiskey drunk and strung out, and he realized that his career as well as his life was about ready to come to an end. And so there in that month, in October of 1967, Cash decided he was done. He wanted out. He didn't want any more. So he jumped in his Jeep and he started driving an hour east of where he lived in Hendersonville, Tennessee, towards Nickajack Cave. It's a cave you can't get into anymore. The government actually flooded the area nearby, flooded the cave with a dam. But back then it had quite a reputation. Cash had visited it numerous times before. It was a place that's known for its twists and turns. In fact, it was a series of caves that had actually taken the life of many an amateur adventurer. And Cash surmised that if he could crawl further enough back in the cave, that he could die in peace and no one would be able to stop it. Like a sick animal, he was looking for somewhere to crawl up and die. So he parked his Jeep and he started to crawl. Crawling and crawling for hours until the light bulb on his flashlight burned out, and he laid there in the darkness, prepared to end it all. In fact, he says in his autobiography, it was a pretty fitting moment, the blackness, not being able to see any light because he had never felt further from God in his entire life. It was time for it all to end. All of his troubles, all of his pain, it was going to come to an end. But it didn't. There in that moment, he actually says he didn't believe it at first. But this peace, this new mindset, this sobriety came over him. And he sat there for a moment and he thought, this can't be real, but it persisted. And he started to ask himself, how can after driving my body so hard, how after taking so many pills, handfuls, scores, hundreds of them, can I possibly feel all right now? But he did. And again, it persisted, and this mindset, this clear mind began to open up for him, and he began to focus on God for the first time in a really long time, and it hit him there, a very real thought, that he was not in charge of his own destiny. He wasn't even in charge of his own death. No, his destiny and his life and his death was going to be controlled by God. Experiencing a rebirth of sorts, he lifted his head and he began to move. He had no clue how to get out from where he had been, and so he began just putting his hands anywhere he could in the cave, just trying to find his way out. And after searching and searching and searching, he finally felt this breeze, this wind on the back of his neck, and he thought that maybe if by following it, he could get out of the cave. And sure enough, he began to see a light. And when he exited the mouth of that cave, there stood June Carter. She'd flown from California realizing something was not right and felt called to go to that cave. She's holding a basket full of some food for him to eat and something to drink, and she held his arm, and right then and there, Cash said that he experienced God in that cave. That in the blackness of Nickajack Cave, he realized something incredibly great. He had not been able to forgive himself for some of the things that had happened and some of the things that he had done, but he realized that God could forgive him. He entered that cave as the man in black, but he exited it as a man of God. His worst day became his best day. Same day. Church, I want you to realize that the adversity that you're facing doesn't have to own your life in just a hurtful sense. It can change your life in a positive way. In fact, I believe that it's in the darkness of the pits in our lives where God ultimately does his greatest work of transformation in us. In fact, I love this quote from Barbara Brown Taylor. She says this in her incredible book, Learning to Walk in the Dark. Sitting deep in the heart of the cave, I let this sink in. New life starts in the dark. Whether it's a seed in the ground, a baby in the womb, or Jesus in the tomb, it starts in the dark. If you're facing adversity this morning, can I tell you something? I can't imagine what you're going through. I don't know what it looks like in the darkness and the pit of where your life is right now. But I do believe wholeheartedly that you may be in the best place you've ever been in your life. Someday you'll look back, and while you would never want to go through what you're going through again, you'll look back and say, you know what? I wouldn't take it back. If I had not gone through that, I would not be who I am today. I would not be what God intended me to be. Or as Joseph uttered, what was intended for evil, God intended for good. In your powerlessness, you become powerful. I've gotten to see this play out firsthand recently. I have a ministry friend whose world was rocked in 2015. He had an addiction that almost cost him his life, actually twice. When things became public, he headed to rehab to try to put his life together, and it was one of the most difficult things of his life, and frankly, he would tell you it was humiliating, considering where he had reached in ministry. He's doing really good now, and recently, he's really open about it and put a post on Facebook recently. The picture of a tattoo he's gotten on his wrist of a semicolon. Maybe you're familiar with this movement that started to take place, but he wrote with it, he said, a semicolon is used when an author could have ended the sentence but chose not to. He says, every time I see this, I look down and I'm reminded that this is not the end of the story, that there is a new chapter developing in my life. In fact, if you were to talk to him today, he would tell you that even though this has been the most difficult, challenging, most awful thing he's ever gone through in his life, that it has been the most rewarding. That because of it, he is a more loving, grace-filled preacher, husband, and father. And he wouldn't take back what's taken place. Church, our adversity is not the end of the story. What we've gone through doesn't have to define us and hurt us for the rest of our days. If you'll turn it over, if you'll release power, if you will hand it over to God, you'll watch as he'll take your mess and making something meaningful. This is not the end of the story. It's time to get out of the pit and realize what God is wanting to do. Allowing your best day to your worst day to become your best day. Same day. Same day. Let's pray. God, I am so thankful for your faithfulness. And the fact that you are never one to abandon us, God, and that you can make the best of any awful situation. That there is no sin, there is no adversity, there is nothing, no evil, God, that you can't ultimately turn around for your good. God, I know that there are some people in this room that need to hear that. Snow and all, and low attendance and all, God, I know there are some people in this room that just need to hear this message, God, that you are with them and that you want to do something with their story. What has happened to them doesn't have to define them. This is not the end of the story. God, we believe that wholeheartedly, and I pray that there are some people in this room that this morning, this is the day where they finally allow themselves to move beyond the pit. That their adversity would not define them in a hurtful way anymore, but instead it would become something that helps them, God, that they would see you working in the midst of it all. They would hand it over to you and let you transform their life. God, I pray that today is the day. God, we pray all this in your name. Amen.
What a fellowship, what a joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arms. What a blessedness, what a peace is mine.